and challenging global security landscape. The maritime domain is no exception to this dynamic. Global maritime operations, crucial to modern economies, from shipping to the construction of sea-based infrastructure, depend on respect for maritime rules, yet these rules are increasingly being challenged. Recent years have witnessed a disturbing escalation of threats: the Houthis' attack on shipping in the Red Sea, persistent attacks on merchant vessels in the Strait of Hormuz, harassment of civilian vessels in the South China Sea, and the rapid growth of the shadow fleet since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. This poses a significant risk to global shipping and the maritime environment. Furthermore, the construction of artificial islands and multiple acts of sabotage against sea-based infrastructure since 2002 further highlight the critical necessity for robust protection and deterrence. These violations, if left unchecked, risk making global maritime operations extremely difficult or even impossible, imperiling countries' economies. The recent discussions about the Panama Canal, in the news very much recently, a strategically important waterway for global commerce, and the increasingly assertive actions of various actors underscore the urgent need to proactively identify and implement effective strategies to strengthen our maritime security through both responsive measures and robust deterrence. Today, you'll hear from distinguished experts and thought leaders who will share their deep insights and analysis. Their perspectives will provide us with valuable opportunities to explore potential solutions and gain fresh views on this pressing issue. Convenings like this are essential to the Scowcroft Center's mission of developing sustainable, nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges facing the United States and its allies. The Center also honors General Brent Scowcroft's legacy of service and embodies his ethos of nonpartisan commitment to the cause of security, support for U.S. leadership and cooperation with allies and partners, and dedication to the mentorship of the next generation of leaders. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce our senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council, Elizabeth Braw. She is the leader of our maritime threats work, and she'll be emceeing today's event. So thank you all again very much for joining us. I'm looking forward to a terrific discussion. I hope you are as well. And without further ado, Elizabeth, please join me on stage.
Thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to be here, and I feel a little bit strange saying it's a pleasure because it is actually a hugely alarming situation in the maritime domain, as we just heard. And I think maybe 5-6 years ago, most of us were still sea blind, but we are not sea blind anymore because we are hearing on a daily basis about things that are going wrong on the high seas, on the world's oceans, and not things that are going wrong by mistake, but things that are going wrong or not going right by design. We already heard about the Houthis attacking shipping, and that has been going on since November 2023. By the way, congratulations on the crew of the Galaxy Leader that was taken by the Houthis on that 25th of November, 26th of November, I think it was 2023. They have just been released. Imagine having been kept in captivity for 14 months. They are now free again, but that's just one crew. Other crews of other vessels continue to face man-made threats in the Red Sea and elsewhere. So that's just one problem. So this is your show of maritime concerns. The Red Sea, we heard about the South China Sea with the maritime harassment of Philippine and other vessels. We also have, of course, the situation in the Taiwan Strait, where we have had a blockade announced several times, and it may yet be implemented. We also have the situation in the Baltic Sea that is the most, I think, critical and closely watched at the moment, involving not just the shadow fleet, but also suspicious cable breaks. And I think what I've been seeing, understanding over the past year, what I've been seeing over several years now, but with increasing clarity over the past year, is that there are participants in the global maritime world who are willing to break rules and who are not embarrassed or ashamed if we, the rest of the world, i.e. other companies, other countries, the global community, if we find out that they break rules. And that is an extremely dangerous situation, because that means that we can't reason with those countries, those companies, to improve their behavior. They are very willing and indeed intent on undermining the global maritime order. And why does that matter? It matters because the global maritime order depends on countries, companies, and every participant doing what they are supposed to do, following rules, obliging or honoring their commitments to treaties and conventions. If they don't do that, we don't have anybody who can force them to do so. And that is where we are at the moment. Countries and companies are violating rules, treaties, conventions, obligations, and nobody can force them to do otherwise. And what we've seen over many years is the US Navy essentially acting as a global constabulary force, being active around the world, trying to enforce global maritime rules, because there is no global maritime police. But the US Navy can't be everywhere all the time. At the moment, it's very busy in the Red Sea, looking after the global maritime order, together with the Royal Navy and a few other participants, on behalf of the rest of the world. But that clearly takes resources away from what the US Navy would be able to do otherwise. And it is, frankly, a totally paradoxical situation in the Red Sea that the US Navy, the Royal Navy, and a few other navies are there to look after, protect the global maritime order, and end up essentially creating a more benign environment for whoever is sailing through, which at the moment are not mostly Western vessels, because since they are being attacked, they have been diverted to the Cape of Good Hope. So we have mostly non-Western-owned vessels sailing through the Red Sea, protected by the US Navy and the Royal Navy. But that is what protecting the global maritime order looks like. Clearly a very troubling situation. And it also raises the question of how much the US Navy and other navies committed to the global maritime order will be able to do as this deterioration, as this deliberate subversion of the global maritime order continues. So not a very cheerful picture, is it? But nevertheless, it's a pleasure to discuss it, because it needs to be discussed, and it needs to be discussed not just by people within the maritime community, but more widely, and indeed across the maritime and naval communities. And it's such a pleasure to be running the Maritime Threats Project here at the Atlantic Council, because it allows that sort of discussion to take place among practitioners in the maritime domain, maritime insurance, navies, and policy making, and among the wider community, including the wider private sector, because the globalized economy depends on the maritime domain functioning properly. If it doesn't, the globalized economy and frankly, our prosperity will be in danger. So it is, despite the somewhat alarming state of affairs, it is a pleasure to be running the Maritime Threats Program initiative here at the Atlantic Council, and I'm incredibly grateful to all those who are involved. I'm also incredibly grateful that Rear Admiral Ben Nicholson is here today. He is the Assistant Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Operations Plans and Strategy in the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations. And I have my cheat sheet here because, Admiral, you have a long career, so I had to print it out so I get everything right. The first thing to say is that Admiral Nicholson is unusual in that he is not just a graduate of the Naval War College, he's also a graduate of the Merchant Marine Academy, which is unusual, but actually the perfect background for you to address the challenges in the maritime domain. He was previously commander of Expeditionary Strike Group 2, and he was also commander of Joint Region Marianas, which I think means you were based in Guam. Yes, and also at the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, the senior maritime official for Guam, which I mentioned, and he has also served on Destroyer Squadron 22, USS Pinckney, USS Sentry, USS Gladiator, USS Defender, and USS O'Bannon, McFall, and Mitchell. So there you have a very long career, but it started with the Merchant Marine Academy, and that again, I think, highlights the very close connection between civilian maritime operations, i.e. the global shipping community, and indeed the part of the civilian maritime domain that is now much in the news, undersea cables. That is also an area that is of increasing concern, but with no obvious solutions. So we are seeing that those two things that are not supposed to be linked, civilian maritime operations and naval operations, coming more closely together, because somebody has to look after the global maritime order. And since we don't have a global constabulary force, it essentially falls to the US Navy, assisted by other navies. So with that, I'll hand the floor to you, Admiral. And Admiral Nicholson has generously agreed to take a couple of questions after his remarks. So have your questions ready, because he only has time for a couple, and he will take them here from the podium. So you won't have to listen to me selecting the questions. He will do that himself, but have them ready so that he can swiftly answer them. And with that, over to you, Admiral.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for that kind introduction. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, Atlantic Council members and guests. Thank you for the honor of speaking with you today at this prestigious forum. I am Rear Admiral Benjamin Nicholson, Assistant Deputy Chief of Naval Operations, Plans and Strategy for the U.S. Navy, an organization celebrating our 250th birthday this year. If you'll indulge me for a moment, I'll start with a quick poll. Now, I realize that a large portion of the audience is watching online, so it's difficult to poll. But for the people in the audience here, by show of hands, how many people have traveled by airplane in the last 2 months? Okay, that's nearly 100%. I think we're probably at about 98% of our audience here that has traveled by airplane in the last 2 months. Now, the question I'll change a little bit. How many of you have traveled by ship in the last 2 months? One. Or two. Was it a cruise? Yeah, a cruise? No. Okay, good. I bring this up to show that our connection with the maritime in general is a little tenuous sometimes. So this is illustrative of the lack of the known direct interaction the greater public has with the maritime industry. After all, most don't think about the entirety of the journey of that Amazon package that travels to get to their front door. As our topic today is about protections of the global maritime order from current and emerging threats, I would submit this begins with the public having a better understanding of the impact of the threats to that order. I applaud the Atlantic Council on efforts to bring to light the threats in the maritime through various forums and articles, such as Elizabeth Braw's recent report on shadow fleets and excessive maritime claims. Very, very well done. To the Council members and those attending, it's no surprise to you the global economy has always floated on seawater. And today, the global economy also moves on the seabed in pipelines and fiber optic cables. We know the statistics. 80% of the world's population lives within 200 kilometers of the coastline. 90% of the global economy moves by sea. 95% of international communications flow through, and $10 trillion in financial transactions transit via undersea fiber optic cables each day. In the United States alone, seaborne trade carries more tonnage and value than any other mode of transportation, generating $5.4 trillion annually and supporting 31 million American jobs. When the maritime is impacted, so too is our economy, our national security, and our way of life. However, this may not be fully understood by the public. where personal interaction with the maritime has decreased over time, and especially in the latter half of the last century, as passenger air travel overtook sea travel in the 1960s. So if we were having this conversation 75 years ago and I asked for a show of hands, very few would put their hands up for air travel and a lot more for sea travel. The global maritime environment is rapidly changing, requiring adaptation to a variety of environments, competitions, as well as operations in every fleet and in the vicinity of major sea lanes, choke points, and shipping traffic. The United States is a maritime nation with enduring national interest in the maritime domain, and our Navy is responsible for protecting those interests and ensuring free and open oceans. As we talk today, the rules-based international order is under threat. On, above, and underneath every ocean in that operating environment. The United States Navy plays a critical role in preserving the global maritime order. With just under 300 ships, roughly 1/3 of those are underway on any given day, conducting operations, participating in exercises, providing deterrence, and conducting training. The Navy and Marine Corps play an outsized role in achieving America's security objectives. Our Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Lisa Franchetti, has charted a course for the Navy to navigate this shifting maritime landscape through her navigation plan. This plan lays out the priorities of warfighting, warfighters, and the foundation that supports them, driving towards readiness for the possibility of war with the People's Republic of China by 2027, while also enhancing our long-term advantage. These efforts will be reinforced by an ongoing call to action to think, act, and operate differently. The U.S. Navy maintains the capability to deter, defend, and if necessary, defeat aggression across the globe. Today, we do not have time to cover in detail all of the operations that we do around the world, so I will highlight 3 areas of ongoing conflict today: the Red Sea, the Arctic, and the Indo-Pacific. In each of these regions, we are actively deterring those who wish to subvert our shared our shared vision for a free and open oceans where all countries, regardless of size or strength, are secure in their sovereignty and free from coercion. The Red Sea has always been one of the world's most vital waterways, and even more so after the Suez Canal opened in 1869. At the Red Sea's southern end, the Bab el-Mandeb has always been a strategic choke point. For the first time in recent memory, U.S. and allied Navy ships are actively defending against threats from Houthi forces targeting in both the terrestrial and maritime domains. Our goal is restoring stability in the region and to minimize disruption to global maritime trade. Since the Houthis' first active aggression 15 months ago, U.S. ships and aircraft have engaged over 400 drones, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and other threats. 400. That's a pretty significant number. Unfortunately, these attacks had become so commonplace, it was often difficult to find reports of the action in the news. Navy submarines joined our ships and aircraft in executing dozens of offensive strikes in the past year. Our warships have faced volleys of threats over periods of hours during engagements in extended operations in a contested maritime environment. This level of naval conflict has not been seen in over a generation. We don't do it alone. Operation Prosperity Guardian, a defensive coalition of more than 20 nations, continues to provide international maritime security in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden. It is this coalition that has defended and continues to defend a strategic strait against attacks on shippings by the Houthi rebels. In this coalition, it is this coalition who hear over the bridge-to-bridge radio in multiple accents from multiple ships, "Thank you," from the mariners who are escorted through the strait. Now, these attacks are sophisticated, using modern weapons and techniques. Many of those weapons supplied by other countries who are often attempt to disrupt international laws and norms. When we mention drone attacks, these are not commercial quadcopters that you can buy easily with a weapon strapped on. These are purpose-built, large, unmanned aircraft. The missiles are not homemade rockets, but sophisticated ballistic and cruise missiles. And the Houthis have continuously adapted their weapons and techniques to increase their chances of hitting a ship. As these changes have been observed, the U.S. Navy, in conjunction with our industry partners, continuously adjusts our procedures, and our software is upgraded and our systems are upgraded, sometimes within hours of observing an event, to make sure we stay at the leading edge and stay ahead of the enemy. After 15 months of these sustained attacks, we are now seeing the Houthis scale back with the recent announcement of a cessation of attacks against vessels owned by the United States or British entities or those flying their flags. We are cautiously optimistic that this vital region will soon be safe for navigation without ongoing intervention by the U.S. and allied naval forces. However, the last 15 months have shown the relative ease a strategic waterway can be held at risk and the significant efforts naval forces must take to keep that choke point open. Shifting to the high north, in the Arctic, the situation is markedly different. There are no immediate kinetic flashpoints as there are in the Red Sea, but this resource-rich region is becoming increasingly challenged. Sea routes, once impassable, are now open for large portions of the year. Russia is expanding its military and economic footprint in the region and making excessive resource claims in the seabed. Additionally, China, though not an Arctic nation, is seeking to normalize its presence and increase its regional influence. While conditions in the Arctic present unique challenges, the United States and our Arctic allies form a strong collective deterrence. This collaboration is essential to counter growing maritime security risk associated with increased activity in the region. Our efforts include participation in multinational exercises like Arctic Specialist, an annual multinational exercise hosted by Norway, and investments in advanced sensing technologies to enhance situational awareness and provide early warning of potential threats. Early last year, I had the opportunity to spend about 6 weeks above the Arctic Circle in Norway to participate in Exercise Steadfast Defender, the largest NATO exercise in decades. This was a formidable display of collective defense and interoperability among allied nations. I was part of the team overseeing maritime and amphibious components that played out in the frigid waters surrounding the challenging landscapes of Norway and the fjords. This exercise tested capabilities in a high-intensity conflict scenario, ensuring the alliance could operate seamlessly across air, land, sea, and cyber domains. With a sizable U.S. Marine air and ground component ashore, the USS Gunston Hall, a Whidbey Island-class dock landing ship, was our sole U.S. Navy ship participant. The ship's operations included the embarkation of expeditionary forces from 3 allied navies and Sweden, who became a full NATO ally during the exercise on March 7th, 2024. These forces did not simply ride the ship, but conducted amphibious raids from Gunston Hall, utilizing their assault craft and equipment. It was very interesting for me to see snowmobiles on the vehicle decks of one of our ships there in the high north. The bonds formed through these exercises, coupled with the interoperability of NATO forces operating in the harshest conditions, should give pause to any adversary who might threaten us in that region. In addition to these exercises, the U.S. Navy operates in the Arctic Sea and on and underneath the polar ice cap. Our efforts in the region, like Steadfast Defender and Arctic Specialist, are critical components of our national security strategy, particularly as we navigate the evolving dynamics like the Arctic. Finally, in the Indo-Pacific, the U.S. Navy's mission is one of active deterrence. Alongside our allies and partners, we are working tirelessly to promote peace, stability, and deterrence across the region, which is becoming increasingly important as the People's Republic of China, or PRC, seeks to reshape the rules of the region. We conduct presence operations, challenge excessive maritime claims, and participate in a multitude of bi- and multilateral exercises. We would like every nation, regardless of size, to be secure in its sovereignty, have access to recognized natural resources, and to be free from coercion. Over the last several years, and especially in recent months, there has been a rise in gray zone operations by the PRC. And they have steadily escalated tensions in the region, an alarming note for those countries there. The coercive actions or unsafe behaviors are felt across the Indo-Pacific, particularly in the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea and surrounding waters. The highly publicized interactions last year where PRC ships deliberately rammed Philippine Coast Guard vessels are concerning. Less publicized are activities such as the 2022 PRC research vessel unpermitted and unauthorized undersea exploration of the Palawan Exclusive Economic Zone, while hiding their identity with false automated information system, AIS, signals. These are only a fraction of the bad behaviors taking place. We are closely monitoring further developments in the South China Sea, as are our partners, allies, both in the region. Now, to my comments earlier about the public not understanding the maritime threats, I'll share a quick illustrative story. A couple of years ago, when I was stationed in Guam, I was asked to speak at a judicial conference, specifically about regional security. I crafted my remarks focusing on maritime law, using statements already made by various leaders, reputable news sources, etc. I highlighted the illegal and bad behavior of the People's Republic of China in the maritime environment. At the end, there was a brief period of questions from the audience. And this was an audience primarily of attorneys generals, chief justices, and other highly educated lawyers from the Pacific Island nations. To my surprise, several, including an attorney general of a large Pacific Island nation, expressed the sentiment, "Why have we not heard about this before?" I found that a bit unsettling. And I think it's something that we all need to work on, is to educate about what's going on. However, the United States will stand firm, protecting our people, our allies, and our interests by securing vital supply chains and critical infrastructure. We continue to strengthen our warfighting readiness and forward posture in the Indo-Pacific. The Philippine Sea, South China Seas are critical maritime crossroads in the Indo-Pacific, essential for ensuring freedom of navigation and demonstrating the adherence to an international rules-based order. Following our navigation plan, the U.S. Navy is enhancing forward presence, strengthening interoperability with allies, and refining distributed maritime operations to deter aggression. In the Red Sea, the Arctic, the Indo-Pacific, and across the globe, the U.S. Navy remains unwavering in our commitment to conducting safe and responsible operations in accordance with international laws and norms. Our presence serves as a steadfast reminder that we will continue to fly, sail, and operate wherever international law permits, safeguarding the principles of freedom of navigation and the rule of law at sea. Whether in the crowded shipping lanes of the southwestern Pacific or across the vast expanses of the open ocean, we stand resolute in our mission to ensure that the high seas remain secure, open, and accessible to all mariners, regardless of their flag or national origin. Our ongoing operations reflect our dedication to upholding global security, stability, promoting peace, and ensuring that no nation or entity can undermine the fundamental rights of law-abiding individual countries and the international community. The decisions we make and the actions we take today will determine the global maritime balance of power for decades to come. The U.S. Navy remains committed to supporting our national security objectives while maintaining a robust presence and readiness. We are learning from the current crises and applying lessons to the development of our future fleet and through our modernization efforts. I hope this discussion has provided a glimpse of the wide-ranging scope of the U.S. Navy's operations and highlighted the crucial role we play in maintaining maritime stability. Thank you for your time today and your dedication to educating and informing on the maritime. I apologize for going a little over, but thank you very much. And do we still have time for a couple of questions? So please, there are some questions from the audience. There's a question over here. The microphone's coming.
Thank you. Hi, Elizabeth Laris, Atlantic Council Indo-Pacific Security Initiative. I do a lot of research on Taiwan and Philippines, and I just noticed, unfortunately in Taiwan, the national legislature there just voted for a 3% decrease in defense funding and 90% decrease in their indigenous submarine program. Obviously, the government there is quite divided. The Trump administration has also announced it's going to, tariff semiconductors coming from Taiwan, the chips. And so I'm looking at the situation, and I'm looking at a Taiwan that actually is very dear to my heart, but I wonder if it really wants to be defended. A number of its naval personnel and its military officers have been convicted or, and also been charged with spying for the mainland. So I'm wondering, how does the United States deal with an entity that may not even want to defend itself? I mean, I'm aware of First Island Chain, its location, the importance of it, but how are we supposed to deal with this going forward? Thank you.
That's a great question. I think there's a number of different pieces to that. First of all, responsible spending on defense by not just Taiwan, the United States, but all nations, to ensure that each nation is putting into their defense what they need to effectively help secure what they're doing. Now, obviously, operating in coalitions and alliances is best, but everyone needs to participate. To your question about the Taiwanese people themselves, I'm not an expert on Taiwan, so I can't delve too far into what's behind the psyche of some of the things that you said. But I think it's important that whatever the direction of Taiwan is in the future, that it is in a peaceful direction. So if the people want to integrate with the PRC, but it's done peacefully, okay. What we're very concerned about is if things are coercive, if things are done in a manner that is destructive. Those are the things that I think not just the United States, but the international community really can't stand for. We want peace, we want stability, we don't need additional conflicts. Thank you. One more? Yeah. Oh, the microphone's coming.
Thank you very much. Eidos Birunas, a Lithuanian diplomat currently working at SIPA. Admiral, you didn't mention doing this tour de horizon on the various areas of concern. You didn't mention Baltic Sea. Can you have any comments, especially now? We're not facing military threats, but this regular cable problem with the AT and power cables is of big concern of us. Even NATO decided to increase military presence. So what is your view on current problems?
No, I'm glad you asked that question. As I went over time already, so I couldn't cover all of the areas. Baltic is a very important area. In fact, I spent last summer in 2024, I was there participating in Baltops, one of our large NATO exercises that took place in the Baltic. It is an extremely important region. The good news, I believe, is the countries in the Baltic and the other NATO countries, as we exercise and operate there on a routine manner, we're very good at operating together. Last year during Baltops exercise, we did a multitude of simultaneous or near simultaneous amphibious landings in multiple locations with multiple forces. And sometimes those forces were, the landing force was from one country, but the supporting ships were from another country, but all very seamless and done very well. So I think that our continuous presence, but also the practice with our allies in that region is very critical. You mentioned the undersea infrastructure, and this is an area that I think that, as mentioned by Elizabeth earlier, something that we need to be concerned with and look at. Now, there are, over time, every year, there are incidents that happen with undersea cables, undersea infrastructure that are either caused by natural events or age over time and whatnot. And then there are things that happen that are accidents, but it's very difficult to discern what's an accident or what may be a deliberate action taken that looks like an accident. that is very hard for us to tell. It takes quite a bit to do that forensics, and even when it's done, it may not be definitive. But as I said earlier, the global infrastructure on the global economy, that runs on the infrastructure on the seabed is critical to pretty much every nation in one way, shape, or form, even if it's not a nation that's on the coast. Those communications, that gas, whatever that energy that happens to be flowing through there, at some point reaches pretty much all of the other nations. So protecting that is quite important. And I have seen what I would think is a really great collaboration in some of the Nordic countries where, working with industry, they do a great job of both industry and the governments and their militaries on looking at the undersea, the seabed infrastructure, and working collaboratively to detect changes, to detect what may be a problem that can be looked into and maybe get ahead of something like that. But not everything can be seen easily. And so it's going to take quite a bit, I think, of the nations coming together. And it's not just a military problem. There are diplomatic issues here. There are economic issues. All of these parts and pieces coming together to combat this threat, to ensure that the larger communities are protected and the seabed infrastructure is protected. Thank you very much. And I think we're out of time. So thank you very much for your time today. I appreciate the chance to speak in front of the Atlantic Council. Have a great day. Thanks.
Well, where to begin? I know where to begin because we have a panel next, but there were so many aspects you brought up, Admiral. And I think one in particular that deserves, well, they all deserve further discussion, and we will have that discussion, but the role of ports and indeed the role of various choke points. And not very long ago, that was not a concern because it was in everybody's interest that choke points operate efficiently, that there be no disruption or complication, and indeed that ports be as efficient as possible, regardless of their ownership. And it just reminded me, as you were speaking, Admiral, that we have had several recent cases where it has been discovered that maybe Chinese investments into crucial ports could be a vulnerability. Well, 10 years ago, it was seen as just money, and it was not a matter of any concern. Now it is a matter of concern. We have seen it in Peru, we have seen it in other countries, and indeed we may see it in Norway in a strategic port, NATO's northernmost port. We are also seeing, as you said, Admiral, considerable activity in the Baltic Sea. And I think one aspect that is really important that you also mentioned is the law-abiding countries' commitment to maritime rules and especially to UNCLOS. And it has been alarming or concerning to see various calls for countries in the Baltic Sea to just seize various vessels that are in violation of rules. Well, UNCLOS doesn't permit countries to simply seize or even sink vessels. That's another popular suggestion. So it is difficult to be on the law-abiding side, but the U.S. Navy is doing its part to uphold the global maritime order. And we'll also look at the role of the private sector, which leads me to the first panel, which Megan Myers will chair, and she will be joined by Audun Halvorsen, who is here from the Norwegian Ship Owners Association, and Svein Ringbakken from the Maritime War Insurer DNK, who is online. So I will yield the floor to you and prepare your questions for these speakers, because this is a crucial part of the maritime order, the role played by private companies, not just in shipping, but across the maritime sector, and including in insurance, because without insurance, no commercial operations. So with that, over to you. Here.
So as Elizabeth said, my name is Megan Myers. I'm a reporter at Defense One. And we're going to start this off with just a little discussion between the three of us, and then we'll open it up to questions. So I just want to start by asking Audun and Sven to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about the threats that your particular organizations are facing right now in the maritime domain.
Mm-hmm. So I'll go first, Svein. Thank you, Megan, and thank you to Elizabeth and the team here at the Atlantic Council for inviting us. Great to be back here. So my name is Audun Halvorsen. I represent the Norwegian Ship Owners Association, the NSA for short. We organize Norwegian ship owning companies operating in all segments of global shipping. So 140 or so companies operating approximately 1,600 vessels operating globally on any given day. So I work on the sort of security and contingency planning side of the building. And of course, for our members, the day-to-day operational risks in the maritime domain is something they face every day. And we also work very closely with Svein and his team at DNK. So I think the big shift we are seeing, and it was described very well by the Admiral. I have to say I agree completely with his description of sort of the changes we are seeing now to the shipping industry. And of course, in the sort of global perspective and the historic perspective, shipping has been both sort of the enabler and the product of the globalized economy. And it is the enabler of the global economic model we know today. And of course, that has been able to develop, especially maybe over the last 30 or 35 years or so, since the end of the Cold War. And where the shipping industry as such almost has become like a common global good, so to say. The threats have been serious at times: piracy, crime, governmental interventions, warlike situations, attacks against shipping. But they have been, I would say, in a sense, on the tactical level, more or less. What we are seeing now is a sea change, I would say. Shipping is both being considered, I think, more and more a potential strategic asset for state actors in a geopolitical rivalry. Mm-hmm. That's a new reality I think the industry needs to adapt to. And it is also an arena for this geopolitical rivalry and conflict where it has become a sort of low-cost area to fight it out, so to say. And we are seeing this now sort of with the situation in the Red Sea, Russia's use of the shadow fleet, the rivalry in the maritime domain in the Pacific. And the cost so far has been low, of course, because the regulatory framework, which has been working very well as long as shipping has been considered a global good, and the IMO has been very effective, I would say, on the sort of technical level, addressing safety issues, addressing crew welfare issues, and sort of the technical side of shipping. And now, as it is becoming increasingly political, it's being challenged, and that creates a new reality. Mm-hmm. And the regulatory framework is more or less based on the goodwill of the actors involved, be they flag states, port states, or the shipping companies themselves. And I think for the industry, this is a new reality to which it now has to adapt.
Take it away, Svein.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Very good. Yeah, so I agree with great points made by the Admiral and by Audun here. I think I joined the industry back in the early 90s. And the tanker wars in the Hormuz and the Arabian-Persian Gulf was just over. There were two rounds of that. And we met sailors that had been shot at with machine guns. And we were basically at that time, 340 ships were attacked, 800 attacks altogether. Once that was over and the Gulf War was over, there were a long period when the major problem for the maritime industry in terms of threats were basically pirates, criminals, and not so much states. And what we're seeing now is exactly what Audun is pointing out, is that you're seeing state actors getting involved. You saw that back in 2019 when Iran or Iran through proxies were attacking merchant ships, tankers in Fujairah in the United Arab Emirates and also in the Hormuz. And I think in the newer time, this is what we've seen as the major example and what we're going to see more of. When there is a geopolitical competition, the maritime industry is one that is relatively easy to target, with sending signals without having to go state-to-state action, right? You see that in the Red Sea, where the Houthis basically, where the 13-14% of the world trade in a normal situation would go through, right? Now, that has, due to the Houthi action, despite the great effort of the navies, there is a reduction of 60% as we speak in terms of transits to that area. That means that the ships need to sail around Africa. That is at least 14 days additional sailing. That means less capacity, more fuel being burned, more emissions, and of course, it will drive prices. Capacity comes at a higher cost. Black Sea, you saw the Russian attack on Ukraine. Black Sea was basically for a long time closed for commercial traffic. There are still 80 ships trapped that were trapped there during the first days of the war action. They are up in the river towards Mykolaiv. And there is no great prospect of getting them out before the war is over. Hormuz is an area, as we insure ships against the risks of war, 3,500 ships altogether, and they're trading all over the world. We're carefully watching now what will happen next in the Hormuz. It's basically never quite a benign area to sail in, and depending on what pressure the Iranians would like to put, they are grabbing for ships passing through there when they want to at times. I think we're going to have to expect more of this state intervention into the maritime. You see, we talked about the gray zone aggression, the Baltics, in the Arctic as well, and the South China Sea. But I think the concerning point now is that, as Audun has pointed out, it's kind of coupled with an attack on the very system itself. The rule-based system for shipping is basically based on the United Convention of the Law of the Seas. And there are pollution conventions and stuff like that that are also being threatened by the apparent willingness of even contracting states to depart from the very principles that they are based on. So that's a new situation. We basically see that not only are there kinetic attacks, gray zone aggression, but there is also a challenge to the system itself, and that makes it harder to address effectively. So I think those are my main points to begin with.
So Svein mentioned a little bit about some of the ships that he represents operating in the Red Sea and how they've had to deal with that. I want to ask both of you, your organizations, what sort of issues you've come across in the Red Sea, how you've been able to handle them, and what sort of lessons learned you've compiled for operating in that area going forward. We'll start with Audun.
Yeah, actually, we haven't had ships transiting the Red Sea since January of 2024. So there were 3 attacks against Norwegian vessels over a span of, I guess, 10 days in December of 23. 1 very serious, 2 almost hits. So that alerted our members to the threat. And we actually came out for the first time in history with a sort of general recommendation for Norwegian ships to avoid unnecessary transits in the Red Sea. But of course, we have been following developments very, very closely. And as Svein said, the overall picture is 60-65% reduction. It's also interesting, as the Admiral and both Elizabeth pointed to see the composition of the ships that continue to sail through and where they have their affiliation. But I think for big parts of the industry, the choice in the end was quite simple to travel around. And of course, the lives of seafarers, I think being the key element sort of in that risk assessment that has been done by the ship owners themselves. But of course, what happens now? Will we see industry moving back to the Red Sea? probably. But I think it will still take time, both from an operational perspective, where basically the supply chains and the commercial side now has adapted to sailing around Africa. But also, of course, in the light that even though a huge effort has been made to degrade the capability of the Houthis, the geography remains the same. They still have capabilities. They still have powerful allies and the potential to get more weapons supplied. And even though this, what should I say, their excuse for attacking shipping through legitimizing that with the war in Gaza and the situation of the Palestinians, there is a real independent political agenda which the Houthis still have. So I think the assessment within industry is that it will take time and a lot more predictability for industry to return to the Red Sea now.
I want to ask you a follow-up on that. Are there a set of conditions you're looking for that might put you more toward operating in the Red Sea again? And are you compiling maybe any guidelines for the ships if they should go back?
There are guidelines, industry best management practices. The different military coalitions have their guidelines. There's a reporting scheme. You have the security being provided, of course, by the Navy presence, US, UK, EU, other actors. But I think this stability over time will be critical. And I guess also a political condition being a more stable, real ceasefire over time between Israel and Hamas. I think that's sort of one of the underlying conditions.
That makes sense, especially since you have
a complex question. Of
especially
course,
since you have other contingencies that you don't necessarily need the Red Sea right now. What about you, Svein? What's your perspective?
Well, I think I agree with Audun. We need to see what the Houthis are doing, not what they're saying, and a little bit of time needs to pass to see what's actually is happening on that front. I think there is also one other noteworthy aspect of this. We praise from very often the navies, the Western navies that are sailing there and assisting the ships, assisting freedom of navigation and the world trade. I think it's noteworthy to see the absence. I haven't seen Chinese or Russian navies intervening to protect civilian ships in that area from the Houthis. Although they are there. And I think we should ask the question, why? And I think the answer is because they are actually seeing this as beneficial to their interests, and it's challenging the rule-based order in the maritime domain.
So speaking of Russia and China, I wanted to ask, how has operating or not operating in the Red Sea and what you've learned from that conflict informed how your ship should be operating in other parts of the world, in the Black Sea, in the South China Sea, and so on?
Well, I think just the question of proper risk assessments is big, and of course, industry organizations are now collectively revising what is called the best management practice. The BMP, which was originally developed to counter piracy, but is now a much broader document covering areas such as the digital domain, cyber attacks, UAVs, USVs. But in the end, it's pretty hard to defend a merchant vessel against an anti-ship cruise missile. So it's at the end of the day, I think a serious threat as long as you have actors, states or state-like actors with access to those kinds of systems and the willingness to use them. A ship is a pretty big target.
Yes.
So.
And what about you, Svein?
Well, I think, yeah, I agree. And these anti-ship missiles are made to take out the warfare capacity of opposing Navy ships. And Navy ships, modern Navy ships, are full of electronics, warfare systems. They're thin-skinned. They're not like the battleships of the Second World War. So these weapons might be effective in sinking these warships or getting the warfare capability out. You haven't seen a lot of sinkings in the Red Sea, 2 or 3. But when they started to use the unmanned surface vessels with a lot of explosives, you saw the first loss of life. I think it's noteworthy that ships are resilient, civilian ships. They're made for carrying maybe 100,000 of tons of iron ore. They won't necessarily sink when they're attacked, but there are human beings on this. There are sailors that have gone to work on a somewhat ordinary workplace. They're not suspected and they should not be attacked.
So as you mentioned, these ships, they don't have, their own missile defense systems. A lot of the times you're relying on navies, on the U.S. Navy, on the Royal Navy to help out. Is there anything else NATO or other allies in the region can do to help these merchant ships get through on top of what they're already doing? And of course, keeping in mind that, the U.S. Navy has a lot of things on its plate already.
No, I think the military actions, both with Prosperity Guardian, Aspides, and also Poseidon Archer, they have been important, highly valued by the shipping community as such, and they show, what should I say, a willingness to step up to protect the principles of freedom of navigation and sort of global trade. But in the end, it's a very ineffective way of defeating the threat, sort of spending SM-3 missiles, I don't know how much they cost, but to engage relatively cheap systems.
Right.
So I think for the industry as such, I think the answer lies in the respect of the threat actors, be they states or others, for the role of shipping, basically the innocence of especially the seafarers, and respecting the rules that are actually there to regulate this maritime domain, which have been working, I would say, very well for decades. And it's basically maintaining this as a critical part of the global economy. So it's a political solution
Right.
at the end of the day, I guess.
Yeah. And what about from your perspective, Svein?
I agree with that. I think like when we had the pirate problem in largely the same area, Gulf of Aden and then the Somali basin in the Indian Ocean, the naval help, assistance and fighting the pirates was absolutely necessary. But it took a kind of a multiplicity of tools to finally kind of rid the area of the problem. And I think it's exactly the same here. It's a necessary but not sufficient component. It needs to be there, but it also needs to be coupled by a political solution at the end of the day.
So the reduction in transits in the Red Sea, you mentioned how that forces ships to go around and to raise prices, for merchants to raise prices to cover the cost of all that extra fuel and time. What are some of the other outcomes of this insecurity in transiting at these areas that people will see, on the back end, that customers will end up seeing down the line, and that may help some of these countries put a little bit more effort into helping the larger shipping community operate?
Sven, you want to pick up on that? I think you know more about the operations.
I think we've seen during the pandemic, we saw disruption of the maritime transportation chain. Things were delayed, and a number of economies were affected by that. And I think connecting the dots for more countries than the US, France, and the UK to step up and get involved, because it's their interests, their economic interests are also at risk, and their population's economic interests are also at risk if these things are allowed to continue unabated.
And just picking up on your question, to add a perspective, I think also the Red Sea crisis, it also shows really how robust the shipping industry is and how flexible there is, at least in most segments, a redundancy. And I think the consequences actually of this 65% decrease in transits through the Red Sea, the consequences have been far smaller than you perhaps could have imagined at the outset. And of course, part of that is just the fact that shipping costs are so low and such a small part of the total product cost at the end of the day. So even sort of substantial swings in the freight rates in most segments have relatively little impact on the end price for the consumer. So it has not, driven, let's say, global inflation on the macro level to the degree that perhaps you would think as you sort of close off one of the world's biggest shipping lanes. So.
I mean, that's an interesting point. That kind of begs the question then, you're coming up with alternate routes for some of these conflicts. How much time and effort is going into looking into other places to go? If the Red Sea is now off limits, if the South China Sea is going to be too sketchy, where else do you go?
But I think, of course, for the Red Sea, you actually had an alternative. You can go around.
Yeah.
I think the big concern for many in the industry, as Svein also alluded to in his initial remarks, is of course the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah.
There is no option but to go through. So you really can't go around. And these sort of binary choke points are perhaps even more strategically important than where you have an alternative, as you did in the Red Sea.
And Svein, from your perspective, what sort of work goes into coming up with alternate routes in order to make it more feasible for your company to insure these ships?
Well, I think it's very easy. It's binary in terms of the Red Sea. You go around Africa, and there are some new trade routes developing, whereby, for example, if you go to Saudi Arabia in the northern Red Sea, you might not transport the goods from. It might be more economical to source the goods somewhere closer to the area, so you don't have to circumnavigate Africa. So there are changing patterns and maybe changing types of ships that they're using for different cargoes. So you might see that similar volumes are taken, but it's carried on different type of ships. So there are definitely adjustments being made. But the big one is, of course, if you get into, as Adrian is pointing out, if you do get a closer of the Hormuz, there are no alternatives than to reopen it one way or another. There is no alternative route.
All right, fantastic. So I am going to put my questions away and pull up this iPad here and start with some questions that were submitted online, and then we will move on to audience questions from in the room. So first question comes from Mike Hogan. And if either of you want to take a stab at each question or one or the other, that's fine by us. Besides contributing military forces, what is one action NATO countries and other allies can take to support the maritime industry in light of growing threats? If you had to narrow it down to one great thing that would help out.
I think actually NATO is stepping up its game, so to say. They are, I think the dialogue and information sharing with industry has picked up. There is an entity under MARCOM, the Maritime Command in Northwood, called the NATO Shipping Center, which works as the liaison between NATO and the civilian industry. They are doing good work. They're a bit understaffed, but it's an important nexus for the industry, and I would say increasingly so. They are also moving into the underwater infrastructure domain. They have established now this cell for critical undersea infrastructure, and trying to get a better, what should I say, interface with industry. And I think that information sharing, that trust being built over time is important. And I think sort of recognizing the linkages and the interdependency between the civilian industry and the military side will be increasingly important. Because looking at the sort of broader picture, I would also say that industry brings a lot of capability to the table, which should be of interest for national governments and for NATO. Of course, on obvious areas, strategic sea lift, ro-ro capabilities, but increasingly also in this underwater domain and energy security. So it's a lot. I think it needs to be more in sort of whole of government, whole of society approach, where you actually also bring the civilian industry on board in some of these security aspects, so to say.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
I pick up on the last point. Actually, the strategic sea lift to continue streamlining for NATO to streamline the procedures to access allied civilian sea lift capabilities. Look at the Dark Fleet. So there's one side, Elizabeth has written about this. Putin and Russia, by getting that large Dark Fleet going, transporting their cargoes, now in peacetime is worrying because it's sanctions busting and it's a trouble, right? It's not good. But also in times of a higher conflict on the conflict scale, they may have secured themselves strategic sea lift capacity for oils and oil products. And I think we should be cognizant of that fact as well and focus on our own capabilities.
Fantastic. All right, our next question also comes from Mike Hogan, big fan. With the continued threats to global shipping, including commercial ships allegedly cutting cables, how do we deal with, quote, flags of convenience in countries like Panama or Liberia? Is it time to put pressure on those countries to provide money for security, or should there be a push by industry to move flags back to larger countries that can provide their own security?
That's an important question, I think. But I don't think necessarily that Panama and Liberia are the best examples. There are other flags that are way, way worse when it comes to sort of quality and transparency, and they are serious actors, I would say, both of those. And of course, very closely associated with the US historically as well, with their registries. But I think that the flag question is important. And of course, historically, the connection between the Navy side and the merchant shipping side was made through the flag.
Sure.
And basically the whole raison d'etre of navies was to protect their civilian shipping. And then that changed in the 50s and from there out. And now actually the flag is just an element of this sort of global common good which the shipping industry has been. And you can literally change your flag in 5 minutes online if you want to do that. But of course, what we are seeing now is that especially the shadow fleet vessels very explicitly seek out the lowest quality flags. You have a registry called the Paris MOU registry, and they have white flags, gray flags, black flags, depending on sort of the safety history of flags and the quality, basically, of the regulatory regime surrounding them. And now the Russian or sort of the shadow fleet tankers are directly now seeking out sort of the lowest quality flags on that list. And also fake registries, which we have seen popping up with mailbox addresses in Mumbai, for example. Eswatini is one example. Suddenly they had a registry which the government didn't know about. But I think it's a question that will become, I guess, part of the industry discussion as it adapts to this new geopolitical reality, is my personal assessment. But of course, from a commercial side and from an operational side, I think, which is equally important, it has worked relatively well. So.
What about you, Svein? Do you think there's any sense in putting pressure on some of these countries to actually protect these ships that they have taken under their flags?
Absolutely, but it's a hard task, right? So some of these, like Audun is saying, like Panama and Liberia, they have good safety regimes and stuff like that. If a country is seen as hosting a lot of this substandard tonnage, and particularly if they are also starting to operate in a troublesome part of on the international security specter, I think bilateral pressure on these nations should be applied to see whether something can be done with that. Absolutely.
All right, this next question is probably principally for Svein, but of course, if you have anything you want to follow up with, more than welcome to. Can you discuss the role that private insurance plays in securing the maritime economy, and how do you see Western powers using insurance in the security domain in the future?
Well, insurance is really, that's a good question. Insurance is really quite important to underpin not only the international liability regimes for oil pollutions and stuff like that, but also the US regime, the Oil Pollution Act of 1990. Basically on the pollution side, on the maritime claims side, you are absolutely dependent on insurance. Now, insurance is not, however, particularly useful as a policeman. You can levy some pressure on the people that are operating in a gray zone or dark zone by putting restrictions on the Western insurance providers. However, you see then that a lot of these companies are moving out from reputable companies, for example, those that are providing insurance for oil pollution liability. And you might end up in a situation, if you have an oil spill from one of these dark fleet ships, that there is no proper cover, and that the international regime, for example, the International Oil Pollution Fund, needs to step up and pay the bill. And then meaning importing nations, oil importing nations, putting that system under strain. So yes, it's important, but much more as underpinning for the normal operation day to day, year in 10 or hundreds of years, but not so much, I think, in time of curbing the dark fleet activity, for example.
Thoughts?
No, I fully agree with Svein. And of course, one of the, I think, strongest illustrations of the growth of the shadow fleet, so to say, in all its different shades of gray, is exactly that ships, especially in the tanker segment, are moving out of what is called the international group P&I insurance. And that has really been sort of a mainstay of the industry for 150 years, I guess. And it has also been, it can be argued, a very sort of effective tool for the serious actors in the industry, but of course also historically very strongly connected to Western interest. And I think that is part of why this regime is now being challenged. And the outcome of that, as Svein says, is highly uncertain. Of course, the pollution side is one aspect of it, but also the fact that this sort of P&I framework regulates a lot of the safety and welfare and health questions for the seafarers themselves. And as sort of these ships move out of that regime, what are the consequences of that for the seafarers on board? How does their sort of work and welfare situation in the end look? We don't know, because these ships are no longer sort of being controlled or being followed up by the flag or by the port signals.
So this is a big one. As there's growing cooperation between Russia and China, how do you foresee this impacting the maritime economy at large? Are they hijacking it?
No, I think the potentially biggest impact on the maritime economy and the industry as such is if or when this shadow fleet becomes a permanent fixture. And you basically have a permanent parallel fleet of substandard tonnage, outside regulations, outcompeting the serious actors within the industry, who'd actually adhere to IMO standards and pay their seafarers decently, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, right now, I think it is the oil trade out of Russia, lots of it going to China, which drives this development. But of course, there are other actors also interested in sort of taking a piece of this. Lots of this oil goes to India, it goes to Turkey, it goes to the Gulf, it goes to Indonesia. And of course, at the end of the day, they have a huge economic interest in maintaining that. But I think also there is perhaps an incentive in exactly the logic which Svein describes on the pollution side. Because if you get an oil spill without decent insurance coverage, and the states have to pick up the tab. How does that influence the sort of cost-benefit analysis on the receiving end? Let's say for a country like India or Indonesia or even China and Russia. So.
What are your thoughts, Svein?
Well, I think when they're working together in challenging the rule-based order when it comes to the maritime, that's a bad signal. I think one of those actors alone would not be able to successfully challenge the system. It becomes slightly more concerning when they are apparently working together. And it's much more of a forceful challenge to the maritime order and fits into the bigger picture of challenging the rule-based order in other fields as well. So I'm concerned to see that these two nations apparently are working closer together in this field.
All right, speaking of the shadow fleet, we've got a question that deals with that. There's been some discussion on the acts of sabotage and attacks levied against undersea infrastructure in the Baltic Sea and elsewhere by ships in the shadow fleet. Are there opportunities for the private sector to work alongside government and military officials to help respond and deter such attacks? How can the private sector help enable greater resilience in this domain?
Well, I can definitely in our insured fleet, we know that there's in the Norwegian fleet. We can talk about that, but there's also true for others. There is a lot of subsea capability in terms of deep sea capabilities that can be utilized and has been utilized to monitor undersea pipelines and stuff like that. And within the audience membership, some of the companies were actually engaged in the North Sea doing exactly that after the Nord Stream explosion some years back.
No, I think this is one of the areas where this, let's say, public-private civilian military partnership needs to step up. And as Svein said, we organize within our association the second largest and most technologically advanced offshore service and subsea fleet in the world. And of course, those ships and basically those capabilities are critical to repair or survey or maintain the infrastructure, be it pipelines or cables. And Norway actually has the only, I think, standing preparedness framework for pipeline repair in the world, owned and operated by the operators, Equinor and the other big operators in the North Sea. So located on the southwest coast of Norway. And I think that is a model which potentially can both be expanded to have, let's say, the same kind of standing capability, working with the industry on communication cables. And it is, I guess, something that increasingly should be seen as a partner alliance capability, not only sort of a national capability. So that is one area. But of course, I think the challenge, if you look at the Baltic Sea incidents, for example, is that these are ships which, at the outset, sort of are outside the regulatory framework and the scope of the systems we already have in order and have in place. And that makes, I think, it makes it much harder also for the industry as such to do any kind of sanctioning or intervention towards sort of that part of the Grey Fleet. So, but I think also, and the Admiral also mentioned this, that there are, of course, also accidents, there are natural incidents. I think globally there has been around 150 damaged cables and pipelines sort of on an annual basis every year. So these things happen. And of course, in a situation where at one end of the scope, these ships can be used in deliberate actions to damage infrastructure, and at the other end, they are old, not maintained, technologically lagging behind. The crews are probably not up to speed when it comes to qualifications and certifications. What is a deliberate action and what is just a result of a rusting hulk of a ship with poor seamanship in bad weather, losing its anchor. So that really sort of creates this gray zone, which makes these things so hard to prove, as the Admiral also said. So.
All right, so I want to open things up to questions in the room. If anyone has one, please raise your hand and we'll get a mic down to you. Elizabeth has got one.
Elizabeth Brough from the Atlantic Council, as you know. I have two questions, one for each. The first one is for you, Audun, which is the effect or the additional effort that goes into going around the Cape of Good Hope. What does it mean for ships in terms of, do they have to make more port calls for staging and so forth? And what is the additional logistical effort that goes around with, comes with going around the Cape of Good Hope? Then for you, Svein, the issue of what constitutes an act of war. So we saw it with NotPetya when a couple of the companies that were attacked tried to claim on their insurance policy, and the insurers said, well, it was attributed to Russia, so therefore it was a warlike act, we are not paying. And we saw that play out in various US courts that then had to determine what constitutes an act of war. And I think you are at the sharp end of that too, as a war insurer. What constitutes an act of war today, and who decides? Is it actually the insurance industry that's left to decide what constitutes an act of war?
So on the operational side, I think Svein mentioned it a bit in his remarks, but depending on the destination, it's between, I think, 8 and 14 days extra sailing time. And of course, you can make up a bit of that with extra speed, but that increases fuel consumption, so fuel costs go up. And of course, it also increases CO2 emissions. So for at least those parts of industry which are concerned with that, and are actually working to make shipping greener, that is a big concern also. And it's a reputational risk, I would say, for industry, which does not really always have a good sort of environmental reputation. And where this question of making the transition to a more climate-friendly fuel and propulsion of the fleet has been hugely important, also at the political level, at the IMO and in the EU, and also sort of within the regulatory framework over the last decade or so. So I think the operational consequences mostly are on the cost side and also on fuel consumption and emissions. And then, of course, what you saw at the outset, and especially during the winter of early 2024, was a readjustment of the logistical chains globally. And if you now move back to the Red Sea, you'll have to readjust them, which is a pretty big operation in today's sort of logistical thinking. So,
yeah, definition of war. So in the old days, war was declared, right? Then there was no doubt whether the US and Japan or England, UK and Germany was at war. Then it was pretty simple. If you had a cover saying that in case of war, a ship is lost, it's paid. Over time, it's developed a number of additions. For example, if it's sabotage, for politically motivated sabotage, then it's falling under the war cover. I think at the end of the day, you need to have systems working together. So the primary response for a hull damage to a ship is in the civilian cover. And if that is all risks, but the ones that are named peril, like war or expropriation and stuff like that, even if there is a little bit of doubt as to whether, and there will be regulations saying that if it cannot be established whether it's the civilian cover that should respond or the war cover. I think you will have more benefits out of working how these two systems work together seamlessly. than trying to kind of amend the war definition, because you'll come up in different circumstances where it's hard to prove what actually happened, and you'll just have the delineation point at a different place. So I think the important thing is to make sure that you have a full system working together seamlessly, like in the when the Malaysian airliner was lost, one was not able to tell what had happened to it. Was it sabotage or was it an accident? Then I think the war market and the civilian market share that 50-50. And I think looking for systems like that, where it's seamlessly covered one place or the other, is the way to go. I think trying to tighten down the war definition, you'll just get the delineation point at a different place.
Good point. Does anybody else in the room have a question? All right, we have a couple more. Oh, here? Yeah, right here. Up front.
Thank you very much. Once again, Eidos Berunas, SIPA. One of the speakers, I think Sven, was mentioning that this is not there's just accidents happening occasionally. This is systematic sort of challenging our system by countries like Russia, China, and Iran, as we speak about Houthis, Red Sea. Are we now in the position still continue to react, or can we be a bit more aggressive in deterring these threats? I'm not talking U.S. only as the industry, but just in generally, governments, industry, NATO, military assets, all assets. Changing legal system, in case of the need, even arresting the ships, and so on. So can we be or I will still continue in debating this and just saying what we should do? Thank you.
That's a good question. I think, if I may, on the you mentioned arrest, and that is quite useful. And I see that in the Baltic now, the owners of one of the submerged lines have actually arrested the suspected ship. And I think that's one way to go. I think if you have infrastructure damaged, to establish a maritime lien to arrest a ship, it's quite easy in many places in the world. And if it becomes known that if your ship is suspected of having damaged something, you might be arrested and kept in a port until some security for the claim has been put up or the investigation is done. I think then the states that are knocking their head against jurisdictional issues might be, they should still take that as far as they can. But I think one should definitely look into the civilian side a little bit more for the apparatus, the legal apparatus that is available there for the owners to arrest the ships wherever they may be in the world. That's one. Number two, I think there are, and have been for some time, serious discussions in NATO as to how far up the scale are we going to allow this to go until response is provided?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Just to add maybe a point of nuance, I think it's a great question, and it's very topical looking at what we're seeing now in the Baltic Sea. And of course, from a ship owner's perspective, it might look a bit more sort of complex. Of course, a ship sailing is basically covered by UNCLOS, right? So you have a freedom of navigation. Part of that is the right to innocent passage, traversing both international waters and also territorial waters, if you're not in sort of the inner parts of territorial waters. That is a very strong principle within the law of the seas. And of course, the Finnish and Swedish actions, they have been very understandable, very effective from an operational and sort of law enforcement perspective. But seen in relation to a civilian ship's right of innocent passage, it's not necessarily black and white. So I think and of course this is a policy question at the end of the day, and something which is up for governments and for the international system to regulate. But also be aware of the kind of precedents you may set for other actors to employ the same logic, let's say, to a Western ship in the Strait of Hormuz. So there is potentially a downside to this also within the space of the law of the seas as it works today. But I think, again, from a threat perspective and from an operational perspective, very sort of forceful work by the Finnish and Swedish governments.
All right, thank you guys so much. That gives us something to think about going into the next panel. I want to have a round of applause for Audun and Svein again for joining us today. And this session is going to be followed by a short coffee break. So we'll reconvene in a moment. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. It's nice to see you again. And we got off to, I think, an incredible start looking at discussing maritime threats and the incredible breadth of maritime threats we are seeing now. We will shortly start discussing them more in detail with Laura Burns and Guy Platten. But first, there is a message I'd like you to hear and see from Paul Johnson, the Defense Minister of Sweden, who is joining us remotely from, I'm not sure what location he is in at the moment, but he's joining us remotely with this recorded message. And after that, we'll get into discussion with Laura and Guy. And please think of your questions while we're speaking so we can dive right into them afterwards. But with that, over to Paul Johnson.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to have been invited to address you briefly on the topic of the growing threats to maritime security and also to the protection of critical infrastructure on the seabed. This is an important topic that's been on the Swedish defense and security policy agenda in recent times for obvious reasons. Since the autumn of 2023, there has been a sharp increase in the number of incidents in the Baltic Sea where important underwater infrastructure has been damaged. Ships have traveled with dragging anchors in the open sea for many kilometers for many hours. More than 10 cables, including a gas pipeline that was part of the civil critical infrastructure, has been seriously damaged. In recent events in the Baltic Sea, that highlights two related threats to this government, which we take very seriously: the Russian shadow fleet and the damage to critical infrastructure. We have met these challenges both with our own measures and together with our allies. Fundamental to handling this event has been two things: that we act resolutely and that we act within the framework of the law. This is, of course, applies to national legislation, but also to international laws where the Convention of the Sea constitutes a framework for what states can and cannot do on the sea. It's a strong Swedish interest that the respect for international law, including the law of the sea, is maintained. The government has implemented a series of measures aimed at improving Sweden's preparedness in the face of a wide-range threats. This includes, among other things, the establishment of a Minister for Civil Defense, a new National Security Council, as well as development of a new national security strategy. We have presented the largest investment in civil defense since the Cold War. A considerable part of this investment will go towards strengthening critical infrastructure to better understand disturbances, for example, in the case of sabotage. The incidents in recent times have prompted the Coast Guard and the Swedish Armed Forces to increase their presence at the sea in monitoring ships. The government has also tasked the Coast Guard and the Armed Forces to deepen their cooperation further. This is achieved to improve the resource utilization, especially regarding the Coast Guard's air and sea-going resources. Increased cooperation between the agencies when it comes to situational awareness and intelligence sharing are other important parts of the government assignment. Sweden is strongly pushing for deepened cooperation within the Nordic-Baltic countries regarding critical underwater infrastructure and management of hybrid threats. We have also entered into a dialogue format with the United States and other countries in the region where these issues have been discussed. The activation of the Joint Expeditionary Force will contribute to our ability to detect suspicious activities in the vicinity of critical underwater infrastructure. The activities is a complement to NATO's activities and involving increased gathering and sharing of information between the JEF countries. Sweden has taken a leading role in countering the shadow fleet as a means to counter the Russian war economy. We want measures that undermine the business model around Russian oil export and the shadow fleet. The sanction criteria must be broadened so that we can get companies that help the shadow fleet to operate. The ships on the sanctions list have enabled Russia's energy export by, for example, transporting oil above the G7 price ceiling, lowering oiling price ceiling, and the strengthening measures to cut down the shadow fleet go hand in hand. At the GEF heads of government meeting in December, our countries agreed to disrupt and deter Russian shadow fleet. A concrete measure that Sweden supported is the request for insurance certificates from the vessels deemed to belong to the shadow fleet. Finally, NATO has strengthened its military presence in the Baltic Sea to maintain vigilance, improve situational awareness, and deter further incidents. The most apparent expression of this is, of course, the NATO activities Baltic Century that was launched a couple of weeks ago at the NATO summit at the Baltic Sea Allies in Helsinki. Baltic Century involves a range of assets, including frigates and maritime patrol aircraft. The Secretary General also announced the deployment of new technologies, including a small fleet of naval drones. The Swedish government has tasked the armed forces with contribution up to 3 warships and an air and sea surveillance capability in the form of something called ASK 890, which is an airborne sensor. The Swedish Coast Guard operates with the NATO activity, 4 ships monitoring priority areas around the clock. More resources are on standby in case of events. To summarize, several measures are being taken to counter the maritime threats. Due to the complexity of the threats posed, more must be done, both nationally and multilaterally. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you will have a good seminar today.
I was just thinking, as Paul was speaking there, rarely has a defense minister arrived in his post better qualified for the job. Paul has a PhD in defense, in war studies, not defense studies, war studies, and has that ever turned out to be appropriate for somebody in politics? How the world has changed. And on that note, I want to bring in Laura Burns from Willis Towers Watson and Guy Platten from the International Chamber of Shipping. Now, Guy is joining us from London, which is, as we all know, the global hub of shipping, which is also where the International Chamber of Shipping is located. It looks after the interests, really, of the shipping industry, but also keeps an eye on the crew side of the global shipping industry, which is so important, because without the 2 million seafarers out there on ships, as you said earlier, without those crews, we would not be receiving any of the products we depend on a daily basis. Laura Burns looks after political risk for Willis Towers Watson, which is, as you all know, a global insurance broker. And I have discovered over the years of the many years now of working in the area of grey zone aggression, that there is no better monitor and detector of early detector of new threats than the insurance industry, and including the insurance brokerage industry. These people are, I have to say, in all honesty, often better than academics at detecting new geopolitical threats. And I think it's simply a result of being in the business of having to insure against threats. They have to understand when new threats arise, so that they are not caught by surprise, and so that they can also, and I should say, they also try to quantify the threats to understand how serious they are, because without such quantification, they would once again be caught by surprise. So 2 phenomenal speakers, and I want to start with you, Guy. You have obviously been not just with the International Chamber of Shipping for a long time, but in the shipping business for an even longer time. So you have seen the changes emerge and then accelerate in recent years. What is it that you think we should be paying particular attention to out of the many threats and risks and frankly, quite dangerous scenarios that not just face the maritime industry today, but are the reality for the maritime industry today?
Thank you very much indeed, Elizabeth. Yeah, and thank you very much for inviting me on to the panel today. It's really good to speak to you all. Firstly, I think shipping is resilient. It always has been resilient and always will be resilient. And I think the Houthi attacks against merchant ships in the Red Sea demonstrate that swift action by companies perceived to be themselves to be at risk meant that 60% of trade that would ordinarily traverse the Red Sea was diverted around the coast of South Africa, with actually, in the end of the day, very limited significant economic disruption. And that really is the hallmark of shipping when faced with sort of security threats, as we saw in the case of Somali piracy, as in the case of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, where trading patterns return to actually pre-war levels rapidly when the threat profile diminishes. So shipping is very a resilient industry, and our seafarers are resilient. But we mustn't forget what they have to put up with. I mean, it's very thankful that the Galaxy Leader, a NYK chartered car carrier that was seized by the Houthis early on in November of last year, that's now been released, and the crew had well over a year in captivity, and they're now reunited with their families. So we mustn't forget that although we're resilient, our seafarers have to face these dangers on a daily basis, whether it be piracy, whether it be terrorism, or whether it be conflicts around the world.
And on that note, Guy, can I just ask you, do we know what conditions the crew was in during the captivity, and also that, what conditions they lived under?
I think it was pretty awful conditions. I mean, they were as well looked after as you would hope, perhaps, but they were still held in pretty awful conditions. They had limited contact with their families. Their families, you've got to remember that they're worrying on a day-to-day basis. My understanding, I don't know for certain, is that they're now reunited, and and that's a great thing. But to actually put up with that sort of thing is just not acceptable nowadays. It just really isn't acceptable that innocent people going about their work should be seized in this manner and be used essentially as pawns in a wider geopolitical game.
Pawns in a wider geopolitical game, that is exactly what you look at too, Laura. On a daily basis, you try to help companies not become pawns, but I don't think it's within your power not to make them pawns, but at least help them reduce the risk they face. So what are the implications of this explosion, so to speak, of maritime threats? What is the implication for the wider global economy? Because it's not just the maritime domain, it's similar targeting of private companies elsewhere as well, right?
Yeah, thank you so much for chairing this conference. It's an incredibly important topic, and I'll just share a few thoughts in that regard. So at WTW, we've done quite a bit of research over the past couple of years. My colleague Sam Wilkins here, who's the author of several pieces that kind of tee up this question, which is we have seen kind of a splintering of the geopolitical divides. We've seen a threat to the international rules-based order, and we've seen more of what you know extremely well, this so-called gray zone aggression, which are these actions that fall short of war, that are going to advance the interests without sort of inviting kinetic war. And this is the domain of our client base. And so I thought I would share some experiences of what our clients, that it isn't a white paper on this subject, that we have seen several clients. I'll start with obviously Ukraine and the importance of the agricultural business, and seeing several of our clients having stockpiles of grain seized or obviously damaged by the explosions and or just outright seized if something sort of become across enemy lines. So that's one domain, of course, and we've written a bit about that, of sort of the economic impact and how warfare can be fought through trying to weaken the economy of a particular country. The second experience is that the Houthis in the Red Sea that we've been talking about. I mean, we have had many conversations with clients who told us about those experiences and how they unfortunately had ships that needed to be, their shipping companies had to amend the route, and that created quite a bit of what we call business interruption or a loss of profit or extra expense, which is something that we insure.
And even just somewhat recently, we looked at, there was a logistics company in, well, they're sort of European, but there were a couple of incidents in both Britain and in Germany where there was an explosion at a couple of warehouses. And this is the kind of thing that political risk is not just present in the domain of emerging markets. Unfortunately, we see with this sort of emerging geopolitical divides, there may be more of a terrorism theater, unfortunately, that we're seeing in Europe, and clients are actively speaking to us about this. So that was one point, just to articulate that this is very real for us, and the importance of modeling these exposures. And I truly believe we will see things that in the next 5 years that we can't have predicted and we haven't seen before. So our advice is to not so much focus on the likelihood potential, but instead really focus on impact. If the black swan or the gray swan or the rhino happens, what is that financial impact to the firm? And lastly, I'll just mention some data. We're of course working with all kinds of different companies, and interestingly, if we look at our inquiries, data on the inquiries of people reaching out for us for either trade disruption insurance or political risk insurance, which would cover some of these things, 42% of the inquiries were not in the, I'll call them, usual industries. There were examples, of course, there's always been natural resources, and we're seeing this sort of, neo resource nationalism, particularly in West Africa and other places of critical minerals in the world. But it's pharmaceutical companies reaching out to us about the Biosecure Act and worried that they can no longer get raw material from China. It's logistics companies, as we sort of talked about. It's just this week we worked with a company. We worked with a university, and their concern is that, and we have seen this, that either government, whether it be the Chinese or the U.S. government, will no longer permit them to conduct research and or have a joint venture with China. Because every industry is sort of now being looked through the lens of national security. And we have seen some of these universities actually sever ties, and that was part of the scope. So if that just, hopefully it gives you a bit of a perspective of sort of a day in the life of a practitioner.
Yeah, and it shows how the threats and not just threats, the attacks on maritime, the maritime industry are taking place in the context of geopolitics entering every domain of the globalized economy. And on that note, Guy, the people who are most exposed are obviously the maritime practitioners, but the crews in particular. Can you tell us a little bit about the effect that all of this is having on the 2 million seafarers? And also, should we worry about not having enough seafarers? There's already a shortage of people wanting to go to sea, but we have been able to fill it so far. But if this continues, who would want to go to sea?
I think seafarers set multiple different challenges, if the truth be known. It's not just about the security threats, which we've talked about, and there has, but also the carriage of illegal narcotics, for example, which are often found on ships, and seafarers are seized as sort of almost as collateral when these investigations take place, often very innocent seafarers as well. So all these things conspire not to make it perhaps the most attractive career. I'm an ex-seafarer, so I speak from some knowledge. But we're doing lots of things in the industry to try and attract the next generation. I mean, ships are very high tech. They are inherently much safer than they used to be. So we are trying to counter all these things. But there's no doubt that the security threats, the maritime security threats, cyber attacks on ships, all sorts of different terrorism, piracy, and geopolitical conflicts are all conspire to put lots of pressure on seafarers going forward. And we're already predicting within a couple of years, there'll be nearly 100,000 seafarers short of what we require. And with world trade still growing, that's only going to get worse. So it's something that is a concern. And that's why, again, we always call out when seafarers are just seized and used as pawns in this game, because it's just not going to keep world trade flowing that way.
And then what happens? So if world trade keeps growing, it obviously will be different than it has been until now because of geopolitical tensions. But nevertheless, countries will send goods to other countries. So what happens if we continue to be short on seafarers, Guy?
Well, I think we'll always find a way because shipping always does. But and trade actually will always flow. And I mean, you know, I think we can see that from sanctions. Somehow, we talked earlier was about the shadow fleet, but somehow trade always does flow regardless. So I'm sure that won't change anytime soon. But clearly, it's a serious issue and something we're taking increasingly seriously as an industry. And it's not just the threats; it's also about the future as well. We talk about a low carbon future with ships, but using zero or low carbon fuels, and the extra training that crews are going to have to get to do that. So, we're facing a lot of headwinds at the moment, but shipping is resilient, seafarers are resilient, and I'm sure we will find a way through.
And just one last point for you, Guy, on that note. Rear Admiral Nicholson, speaking earlier, asked how many people had been on an airplane within the last 2 months, and everybody had, and then how many people had been on a ship. Well, Audun was the only one, apart from somebody who had been on a cruise ship. So there clearly is lack of exposure to the maritime world.
Yeah.
What to do about that? Should the shipping industry invite people to come and have a look and see for themselves? Because sea blindness will continue to be a problem, and it may not have been such an acute problem when there were no threats to global maritime operations, but now that they are under threat and need more support and we need maybe to understand what the complications are when the maritime industry is attacked. So how do we get that exposure?
It's very difficult. It's sea blindness, and we're trying our best. I think just events like this highlight the cause of seafarers, and that's always really good. But it's interesting, isn't it, when the Galaxy Leader, that ship was seized, and the 25 crew members effectively taken hostage. I wonder what would have happened if that ship had been an aircraft stuck on a runway with 25 people on board. Would the world have reacted in a different way? I suspect much of the media moved on from the Galaxy Leader quite quickly, and I wonder if that had been the case, it had been an aircraft, and that's something that we have to confront as an industry. Seafaring is very much out of sight, out of mind. We saw that during COVID, where countries shut their borders for perhaps legitimate health reasons, but they still wanted the trade to flow, but they wouldn't let the crew members get off their ships. And we had cases where the crews were denied medical treatment. We had seafarers who sadly passed away, couldn't get their bodies off the ship. It's very much an unseen world, and it needs events like these to highlight the cause of seafarers and for what we do as well, just to highlight that. I think most people's image of a ship is probably a cruise ship or a ferry or something like that, where actually 90% of global trade is moved by ship at some time, and that's something we need to bear in mind.
Laura, before I ask you the next question, can I just ask here in the room, who has constructive suggestions about how to cure sea blindness? Nobody. It's hard, right? I mean, feel free to have a think and then present your suggestions after Laura speaks, but it is extremely hard. Laura, is there a clash between people's expectation that the economy will continue to function even as geopolitics targets the globalized economy? And so that on one hand, and then those threats to companies which cause financial losses, disruptions and so forth, so their ability to keep going and to essentially keep their books in relatively good shape. The two are clashing, right? And so what gives?
Yeah, I mean, to your point, I'm an optimist. I think trade will continue, but I do think that a lot of cost will be, at the expense of some of the companies that we work with. And trade may continue, but it may be more expensive. There may be extra costs to having to reroute ships and things of this nature. So I do think that there's quite a financial burden that organizations need to be aware of. And secondly, I think, pointed to some of the research that we've done is I think trade will continue, but I think there's a large question about sort of this beginning of I'll call them sort of trading blocks, and to the extent of, yes, there is trade, but with whom? And you know, what are the groups that are trading amongst each other? And we do, I mean, even just think about this week with AI and so forth, you know, this view that there may be sort of two technology systems evolving, right? And you know, we're cut off from theirs and vice versa. And so I think that organizations, there could be, you know, huge financial impacts that could cause a restatement of earnings or other such implications, that there may still continue to be trade, but I think it could be very different.
Yeah. And between different countries. I was just thinking, as we were speaking, Laura, I was thinking of a conversation I had a few years ago before this started with a shoe executive in the UK, and he was talking about that company's costs. And so they make they're a UK-based shoe company, but they make their shoes in China inevitably. And he told me it's cheaper for them to send, or it was at that point, cheaper for them to send their shoes from the factory in China to the UK than it is to get them from the warehouse a few hours from London to London. Well, what does that mean? It means that you are dependent on shipping for essentially the financial health and any health of your company. Guy, I wanted to come back to you again. So will we see companies leave the maritime industry simply because this is not a sustainable model of operating when you have your sector being the soft target, as was discussed in the previous panel, the soft target for geopolitical activities? Is it even sustainable to be in the maritime industry anymore?
I don't certainly see any signs of people exiting the maritime industry. I mean, we manage risk. I mean, that's what shipping companies do on a day-to-day basis. And we saw what happened in the Red Sea. Companies merely just rerouted their ships. And yes, there's an additional economic cost, but ultimately that has to be passed on to the consumer in the end of the day. So I don't see that necessarily being the case. It's a market economy. It's a true market economy, so that if threats rise, then the cost of doing the business goes up as well. So I think shipping companies are very good at adapting to the risk, to changing the way they operate in order to mitigate the risk as much as possible. And I do know that speaking to company after company, keeping their crews safe is at the foremost of their mind, which is why, you know, as we say, nearly over 60% of the trade got rerouted around the coast of Africa, and rather than up through the Red Sea, just for that reason.
Yeah. Do you think there will be will there be a change in attitudes among the countries that constitute the most, that contribute the most seafarers? So most seafarers come from India and the Philippines, right? What if India and the Philippines say it's too dangerous for our nationals to be in the seafaring business? Do we need to think about how to recruit people within our own countries to go to sea?
Well, I think in some ways, you know, obviously finding seafarers, I'm a seafarer, I came from the United Kingdom. There's still seafarers coming from the United Kingdom, but predominantly the labour supply countries are likes of India, China, Philippines, Indonesia. You know, but these are, especially for the likes of the Philippines, Indonesia, these seafarers bring in much in foreign income as well. I mean, it's many billions of dollars coming into the Philippines. So there's a, you know, that their business model in a way is outsourcing supply of labour as well, isn't it? Whether it be seafarers or it could be other trades as well. So I don't think that's going to change. But clearly, we are in discussion with those authorities. We try and mitigate the risk. But ship owners are incredibly responsible towards their crews as well. There is a bond there which tries to keep them safe. And I think as long as they have the assurance that they're being kept as safe as they can, I do think we'll still be able to call on these great people to come and work for us.
And they are doing incredible work. I wish there were ways for us to see from afar, since we can't get on ships very often, to see from afar what it's like working on a ship. We see it for ourselves every single day when we fly. We know what it's like to be a crew member on an airplane, but it would be great to have that understanding, I think, what it's like to be a crew member on the ship. And it entails, as I've learned in my now several years long crash course in the nature of the maritime sector. It entails very detailed and skilled duties involving obviously extremely large and valuable vessels. So if you make a mistake, that will be a problem. So this is not unskilled work, it's highly skilled work without which we would all be in trouble. Laura, by the way, this is your 2-minute warning that have your questions ready after Laura answers. So are we seeing a refashioning of the global economy as a result of companies essentially becoming soft targets for geopolitically motivated aggression?
Yes, I think our view is that this is a new theater of war, if you will, a new domain.
And can I ask you, what constitutes an act of war? I asked in the last panel. And
oh, in terms of definitions, right?
Because it's down to the insurance industry to define what constitutes an act of war, right?
Correct.
We don't have one.
Yes, there is a definition in marine policies, and I guess I should give you the landscape too, because there's sort of lots of different insurance coverages for war, and they all don't mean the same thing. So in a dynamic, because of what's happened with the undersea cables and Houthis in the Red Sea and these events, is that the marine insurance market has become a lot more conservative. And they have the right to issue cancellation on the war peril, to your point, on the war peril and a certain definition of it, which also includes more things besides just sort of physical damage. It includes seizure and other things. So they, with about 7 days notice, can issue cancellation of the war peril. Well, if something like what we saw happens, in the Red Sea, that maybe it won't go on for, more than 7 days, but there's a good chance that it would. And so this insurance that people have procured to cover them for these things may actually not be active at the time that they need it. So one of the things that this other political risk insurance market does is provide this non-cancelable cover that sort of lays on top of that and then, comes on stage, if you will, at the time that the marine cover wouldn't. And it's non-cancelable cover. So that's an important point.
Yeah, that is a reality today. That insurance may not be available when you need it, simply because it's too risky even for the insurers to underwrite the sort of risks we're seeing today. And this is, by the way, the reality of geopolitically motivated aggression. Insurance is there to provide coverage for companies against moderate risks and risks that can be calculated and modeled and so forth. But if attacks on business become a substitute for war, then there is no way that the insurance industry can keep covering ordinary business activities, right? Because it becomes such a burden.
True. Something key is always that we counsel our clients to seek cover, before the it's front page news, and then they're sort of grandfathered into coverage. But I was going to mention something about definitions and these other things. That's been a lot of this is bespoke. So we've been spending a lot of time on bespoke definitions and not just looking at the definition of war, but looking at the definition of sabotage and looking at the definition of requisition of use. So if a non-state actor were to essentially seize something, so which I think in this domain is very applicable, making sure that those kinds of definitions are being used. So it's really critical to be quite the technician when it comes to definitions. But something in the maritime space to be aware of is that we do cover what we call the exclusive economic zone. So in the sense that we're covering a host government and they have the exclusive economic zone, we are territorial waters, then we are able to that is part of the scope, which is becoming increasingly
It certainly is. It certainly is. And I think everybody here in this room is aware of the difference between territorial waters and the exclusive economic zones. So, questions. I will start with an online question. Okay, one question here and one online question. I will take turns, so make sure to have your questions ready. How is an insecure maritime operating environment impacting Western countries' ability to leverage sanctions? I think that's one for you, Laura.
Is it? Well, I think we're seeing sort of the use of insurance maybe helping to enforce some of the sort of order, right? I mean, if ships needing insurance in order to transit and so forth, that it can be a tool, sort of an instrument to actually help impact some outcomes that may be desirable.
Yeah. I wonder if generally a chaotic maritime environment means that there is less opportunity for Western governments to impose sanctions. That might be one for you all to discuss with Audun after this panel. Your question from the floor, and think of your next questions after this one and the next one here.
Great.
Yeah.
Thanks. Liz Laris, Indo-Pacific Security Initiative. So first, to address your question about like going on ships, how can we get more people to go on ships? Gosh, I remember when I was in grad school, I didn't have money, honestly, to fly to China. So for my research, someone recommended go on a ship, go on a cargo ship. You know, as a young single woman, I was not going to do that. But is it a possibility, honestly, to have more passengers on cargo ships? Okay, so you're going to answer that. Yeah, so I mean, that would be one way to do this. Okay, the other issue I wanted to mention was that, you know, again, when I was in high school, a bunch of the guys graduating went and joined the Merchant Marine Academy. I'm from Long Island, a bunch of guys would join that. But I rarely hear that now. I understand we have nearly a deficit of about 2,000 merchant marines. So obviously we need to increase those numbers. So how can we make it, I know it was prestigious to join, but as far as the public goes, I don't know if people even are aware that we have a merchant marine. And then not only would they protect, of course, cargo ships, but could be used as supplemental military, as China, we know, is doing with, you know, a lot of their civilians.
Yeah. Yeah, Guy, I think that's partly one for you.
Yeah, two good questions. First, yes, you can go on board cargo ships. I think you just need to Google it. Every cargo ship can take up to 12 passengers, actually, without compromising their life-saving appliances or their certificates. So there's a few companies out there who actually do offer voyages on cargo ships, and if you know, they're usually well booked up when they do. So do have a look online if anyone's interested in doing a cargo ship voyage. In terms of recruitment, yeah, that's a common problem we've had, particularly in the Western Hemisphere as well. I go to a lot of nautical colleges, and quite often it turns out that the people at the colleges have got a relative who's already at sea or a relative who's been at sea. And that's, for example, my daughter's a ship's captain. And the only reason why she went to sea is because she said she would ask me some questions about it. So that's often a cause of recruitment to it. But getting the message out there, it actually is a really rewarding career. You get to travel. It's rewarding financially, and it's a great industry to work in. So most people don't spend their entire career at sea. Most people, like myself, do maybe 10, 11 years at seafaring, and then the rest of their careers in very shoreside jobs as well. So there's all sorts of avenues open up to people, and I think it's, you know, once we get young people to understand that, it's actually a really, really fulfilling and worthwhile career to pursue.
Fulfilling, worthwhile, indispensable, and with lots of different skills. I have been just blown away myself during this several years long crash course of the maritime environment to learn what an incredible range of skills is involved in working on a ship in different capacities, both as a rating and an officer. One more question here. Online, growing cooperation across authoritarian and non-state actors disrupts international security. As such, can you discuss the spillover effects of maritime issues in the Red Sea and how that impacts other regions across the world? I think maybe if the two of you can collaborate on answering that question, maybe starting with you, Guy.
Could you just repeat the last bit of that question?
Can you discuss the spillover effects of maritime issues in the Red Sea and how that impacts other regions of the world? I guess it has set an example for the harm that non-state groups maybe operating on behalf of a state actor can cause to the globalized economy and to the maritime industry?
Well, it slows things down, that's for sure, because the trip around the south coast of Africa, typically to Europe, from Asia to Europe, will take 10 to 14 days longer than going through the Red Sea and through the Suez Canal. So immediately you have disruption to the overall supply chain, you have delays and in products getting to market and the like. So there's an immediate spillover into that. There is a cause and effect there, which, although we're resilient and we soon adapt. But it's also it puts it exposes the vulnerability to the supply chain. We saw that firstly, if you remember, when a huge ship called the Ever Given ran aground in the Suez Canal.
I think that was everybody's first lesson in maritime operations.
That's right, and you just saw the effect of one ship. It had in terms of disruption to the world economy. We've got Panama Canal, which it's okay at the moment, but for the previous couple of years has been running short of water. So they've had to restrict the number of ships using it. So there's lots of choke points, lots of strategic choke points around the world, which will and has a disruption to the supply chain, which makes effectively makes things take longer to get where they need to get to.
And I think, if I may answer this question partially, the Houthis may have inspired other groups to try similar tricks in their regions, even though few bodies of water are as exposed as the Red Sea, but nevertheless, other non-state groups will probably be inspired by the Houthis' success, which has been extraordinary. And if I can just make another quick point myself, how many people have noticed any difference in the arrival of their goods, whatever it is they consume on a daily basis? How many of you have noticed an effect on the arrival of your goods since the beginning of the Houthis campaign in the Red Sea? Sort of, yeah. So one person, sort of. I mean, that speaks to the resilience of the shipping industry. What have you noticed?
Specifically where I work in my skilling practice. Thank you, sir. Specifically where I work in my practice in the medical industry, there's some goods that may not arrive in a timely manner if they're imported.
Yeah. So somewhat of an effect, but most of us have seen very little effect or no effect at all. It really speaks to the resilience of the shipping industry and the hard work of the people who get us the goods we need anyway. So my point is how much further can this ability be stretched? Laura, did you want to come in on that?
I mean, I guess just to as an additional point to say that we talked about the increased cost that would be passed on to the consumer. So that's one thing that could potentially be managed, is just the increased cost, the shipping costs, if you need to reroute and so forth. But in working with several clients, we do see several circumstances where the timing is also a key issue. So if goods don't get to market, for example, in the apparel industry, goods need to get to market at the beginning of the season because that's when they're full price. If it arrives 1, 2, 3 months later, it's either out of fashion or it's heavily discounted. So that's a big impact on the economics of the season. Some goods are seasonal in nature, or they need to get there before the big Christmas, or they have to get there before Halloween. Or if it doesn't get there in time, there could be contractual penalties and other such things. So I guess there is tremendous resilience, but we have experienced alongside our clients several circumstances where delay has had a huge economic impact as well.
I see the questions flooding in here online, but I want to give people in the room the opportunity to speak. So over to you.
Okay, I hope this question won't sound political. The question is, under the previous administration, there was a pretty robust response to the disruption in the Middle East by the Houthis. I know there was a coalition, but it was kind of a U.S.-led coalition. Let's imagine the U.S. is less willing to respond in the event to protect the rules-based order or the maritime order in the future. How much, if that proves to be the case, how much of an impact would that have? And who should step in?
If the U.S. government, U.S. Navy is unwilling or maybe unable because it's busy elsewhere, Guy, would you like to tackle that one? And we may actually single out Odin, who spoke in the previous panel, to see if you have further observations. But Guy, starting with you.
Yeah, Thank you very much. I think it depends on the nature of the threat and where it is as to what happens next. But we certainly saw with the Red Sea, even with the great initiative and leadership thrown by the United States in protecting the Red Sea and the like, even so, many shipping companies chose to divert round the south coast of Africa rather than run the risk. I think the days of naval convoys are probably are not there anymore in any case. So, I just think shipping would find a way through. It would, and I think other players may just step forward. Who knows? But it really does depend on the nature of the threat as to what action's taken. But there is, for example, with the Red Sea, an alternative route which ship-owned companies took in the end.
Did you want? Okay. Next online question, and have your in-person question ready for a few minutes from now. A really good one. How does the current situation impact the ability of the shipping industry to adapt to emerging technologies and environmental changes? Guy, I think that's one for you. So I guess the green transformation is having to wait.
It's not really, to be honest with you. But the emerging technology certainly is a real and present issue and a challenge. Cyber threats do exist, and we know shipping companies have been targeted. And the more interconnected ships are to the shore, the more vulnerable they are to attack. We have lots of strong procedures in place to deal with that. But nonetheless, we did a survey of major shipping executives last year, and we're going to repeat it this year. And cyber attacks was one of the things that were keeping the CEOs awake at night and the threat to the ship. In terms of the environmental thing, there's work being done at the International Maritime Organization. As an industry, we know if the fuels are available, that the industry is capable of decarbonising to burn zero carbon fuels, whether that be ammonia, whether that be methanol, or indeed in years to come, nuclear as well. So we know there's alternative means of propulsion. What it is what the political will is out there to make sure these fuels are provided for, I think, going forward. So some big decisions being taken globally this year at the International Maritime Organizations, but it'll be interesting with the change of regime, obviously, in the United States and elsewhere, what impact that's going to have on those discussions.
Yeah. And I was just reminded of the incident here in Baltimore with a ship colliding into the Francis Scott Key Bridge. And I don't think we have answers yet as to what happened there, but yet another example of how we take shipping for granted and only realize the complexity involved when something doesn't go right. The next question from the room, and I've been instructed to ask you to stand.
Hi, I'm Mike Hogan from the Ford Defense Program here at Land Council. You talked about the important role of insurance in the industry right now and on the leading edge of identifying risk and stuff. But in some other industries, we've seen insurance take a step back due to like climate change in Florida with the big hurricanes or the fires in California. So assuming such as a blockade of Taiwan situation where there's going to be a lot of risk and a lot of money being out, or a axis of aggressors type campaign of the Houthis plus some blockade situation or something where you guys are stretched thin and can't play a role or choose not to because there's no financial incentive to it. What comes of the industry then?
Yeah, great question. I think something that is distinctive about this domain of specialty political risk insurance that's a little bit different than, let's say, personal lines or some others, is that they have policies that are much more short term. And so, for example, as the threat is increasing, they're able to non-renew, right? And unfortunately, that may happen.
The homeowners in Pacific Palisades.
Yeah, as an example. Something distinctive about this area is that the policies by design are multi-year. Working with some of the public agencies that offer political risk insurance, policies can go out for up to 20 years, and the coverage is non-cancelable. So the idea, to your point, being that businesses need certainty, and they need to be able to sort of bank on the insurance being there, and that is one thing that is a bit distinctive than some of the other insurances, is that they are, multi-year. I think there's a point to your comments that not every policy is going to be a 10-year policy. And if certain events take place, will there be a market for a certain risk in 5 years' time? And that, so our counsel would be, even if the tenor, as we call it, or the policy period is more expensive to take a 5-year policy or a 10-year policy than a 1-year, 2-year policy, to do that, because that is tremendously useful in a period of uncertainty.
And because you never know, essentially, whether that policy will be available a couple of years.
Correct. When it does come for expiration, if certain events take place, a prudent underwriter may not want to renew that. So it's about locking in, having the foresight now and sort of locking that in.
Next online question: in your opinion, what should be the immediate steps the alliance should take? I guess NATO is intended, but other alliances too should take in order to strengthen and secure the freedom of our seas. Guy, what can Western governments do that they haven't already done? Western and other law-abiding, other countries, governments committed to the freedom of the seas.
I think that's exactly it. We need governments to actually commit to what is it actually international law, UNCLOS, and freedom of navigation, the right of innocent passage. These things have been under threat like never before, and I think that doesn't serve any state well in the end. And these are values that we should be upheld by every legitimate government around the world. The right for innocent passage, the right for freedom of navigation, and the right to trade, I think, is really, really important, and to comply with international law. So it's not just about the Western Alliance; it's about all countries committing to this, and all we can do as an international chamber of shipping is to call out when it doesn't happen correctly, as we do each and every single time.
What are some of the recent examples you have tried to bring attention to, apart from the obvious ones like the Red Sea?
So we just talked about the Red Sea and the Houthis. I mean, it's the aggression against merchant ships was unacceptable under any level, against all norms of international law. We've had threats of piracy in the Gulf of Guinea, where crews have been kidnapped. We call that out each and every time, because that's illegal, mustn't happen, and not even thinking about the awful effects it has on the crew themselves and their families. So every time there's a threat to navigation, we will call it out. So because that's what we need to do, as I know does the International Maritime Organization as well.
Before I ask Laura a question, I just have to ask you, Guy. We saw, since you mentioned piracy, we saw with the recent case of piracy, the Indian Navy intervened to free the crew, which was mostly Indian, and it was really an incredibly sophisticated operation, so impressive. And I wonder, Guy, if you think there is a role for maybe navies, governments that haven't really been playing a massive role in upholding the global maritime order, whether there's a role for them to become more active in maybe particular areas where they may have expertise, such as counter-piracy involving the Indian Navy.
Well, I think I think what the Indian Navy did was absolutely great thing, and navies do get involved, and perhaps there needs to be a little bit more involvement from navies as well to actually counter these threats, because it's in their interest. And let's face it, isn't that really what navies were invented, or created for in the first place, which was essentially to protect trade? But protecting ships and protecting their crews, you are protecting trade, and trade is so important.
It is extraordinary how we have come full circle. Navies were created to protect trade. Then we created this massive international collection of treaties and rules and conventions that meant that trade could essentially happen because it was in everybody's interest to allow it to happen and to not be undermined or harmed. And now we are back to navies having to protect trade. Laura, the next question is for you. Actually, it's time for a question from the room, if we have one. Okay.
Hi, my question's for Laura, and thank you for joining us today. I'm curious if the insurance market is looking at any areas of emerging threats and where those would be, like perhaps the South China Sea. I know there's been incidents there. Are those threatening to business interests, or under the new administration with talk about the Panama Canal, is that of any concern, or any other regions that you have in mind?
Sure. Well, we're always horizon scanning, I guess, is our role. And it's a bit of a feedback loop, right? So we give our perspective on our outlook, but then we're talking to clients and corporations every day, and they're sharing with us their experiences, but then which then forms a revised outlook, I guess, if you will. So certainly, I think something that we're watching with any new administration, but particularly stylistically, perhaps with the new administration, there may be more uncertainty, and so I think that's ultimately an underpinning of what we're looking at is particularly on a trade level, and while some negotiations, there may be, stylistically a certain negotiation style to go for tariffs or what have you, but what we're looking at is might the counterparty retaliate, pulling on a different lever. So there's sort of an assumption that it's a tariff for a tariff, or but what if the tariff turns into something else, and they, retaliate by going after American firms in Mexico, of a particular kind in a different way. Or, in China, we've seen obviously this unreliable entity list, and how may that develop further. That's something that's, chiefly top of mind at looking at. So for us, I think it's West Africa when it comes to particularly sort of those geopolitical divides and influence on the continent, and how may that affect certain Western businesses that are operating there in terms of concessions or treatment. I think obviously we're looking in the Asian theater at what may happen there. I think and even some locales that you wouldn't think are high risk, but places like the Baltics and increased terrorism in this domain of gray zone aggression, are just a few, but those are some, to answer your point.
Thank you, Laura. And Guy, a question here for you. With 5 minutes to go, so we will, as ever, try to be brief. How can industry contribute to preserving the maritime order? In other words, can industry on its own create new rules and standards to somehow shore up the maritime order?
Thank you. I think we're one of the few global industries, along with aviation perhaps, which is regulated at a global level through the International Maritime Organization. And we have many international conventions. First of it was the Safety of Life at Sea, which came about after the sinking of the Titanic as well. So we've got a lot of international conventions. We're used to an international rules-based order. So we will always make the case for international rules because it makes trading a lot easier. And we're already trying to raise the profile of the need for international trade. We see around the world areas where national governments are taking decisions, protectionism, whatever you want to call it, and we will continue to bang the drum for free trade because we know that trade lifts people out of poverty, and it's the right thing forward. So we held a summit recently in Hong Kong to highlight these issues, and we'll continue to do so in Athens this year as well. So I think we have an obligation as an industry to raise and to remind people of the good things that come about through trade and what shipping can do as a force for good in that area.
And not just the good things, everything. It is the case that almost everything we consume or wear or use has been transported by sea, thanks to the labors of many people from all the way down to the ratings to do that hard work and skilled work on ships. Laura, the last one's for you, on a somewhat less upbeat note, but if the situation continues to deteriorate, what are the worst case scenarios for the global economy and geopolitical stability?
My goodness.
I mean, of all the, one of the things that we do with my colleague Sam, who's here as well and can chat with people when we conclude, is to model these exposures. And so, there's a certain baseline, but then what's really important, as we all know, is that you can, it's not it's not an actuarial science, right, of this political risk. And so you can't just take a baseline of current conditions and expect to extrapolate out. So we need to stress test that under certain scenarios. What are those scenarios? And certainly, I would say, top of mind is clearly, I would say, Asia, the South China Sea, and Taiwan, just because obviously so much economic impact potential there. And I mean, we have just anecdotally speaking with several clients, there are some shifts of where people are doing business, but I still think there's a tremendous amount of economic impact in that theater.
Yes, there is. And I just want to bring up, mention one more thing, which you mentioned earlier, Audun, the risk of hostile states targeting our ships in different ways, i.e. potentially seizing them when they are not in territorial waters. We saw it with the Stena Impera, was it in 2019, where Iran claimed that the Stena Impera had been in Iranian waters when it was not. So we can see it's essentially open season for innovation in the space of targeting maritime operations, and that's why it's so important for us to monitor what's happening and hopefully to draw conclusions like you do, Laura, and you do, Guy, to at least try to anticipate, even though we have no way of knowing for certain what adversarial actions may be coming our way. But with that, thank you, Laura. Thank you, Guy. And thank you all for being part of this conversation. It is, unfortunately, it's not getting better. We haven't been able to solve any problems so far, not even the problem of how to get people onto ships so they can see what it actually looks like. That's a question for you to solve during the coffee break, because it's a relatively easy one compared to the many bigger ones facing the world today. And the global maritime order really is the thin edge of the wedge, because it is based on everybody complying, or almost everybody complying, with the rules and conventions that are in place. And if they don't comply, we will have problems, which is what's happening now. And if we don't manage to maintain the global maritime order, we'll see similar deterioration in other areas, which is why this is so important. It's important not just because we care about the seafarers, we care about everybody else who works in the maritime domain, and because we depend on them for our livelihoods, but also because this is a sign of things to come in the rules-based international order. So thank you all for being here. This is an event that's part of the Maritime Threats Initiative here at the Atlantic Council, which I'm very pleased to be running, despite the frankly, quite troubling content, but it is an area that has to be monitored and has to be brought outside the domains or the corridors of maritime operators, simply because it concerns all of us. Rarely has there been a geopolitical problem that has had such an effect on every single person around the globe. I can't think of a single one. So it is vital that we pay attention to it, study it, discuss, and hopefully come up with solutions. And I also want to thank DNK and the NSA for being part of the Maritime Threats Initiative, and to Audun for coming here from Oslo to be part of this. It's a great pleasure to have you here. And thank you all for coming, and I hope you'll continue the conversations you have already started outside the door, and hopefully in many more places, so that we can create or come up with those good ideas, constructive ideas that we need. So thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.